Armand never did anything wrong, okay? You cannot blame him for the things that happened. Were like circumstances. Lies. You cannot blame him. What the fuck? Like, take some responsibility. And also, like, Armand is just the worst, okay? He's the absolute worst. Hi, my name is Claudia. I really love Armand, and we do have to talk about him. Ever since the second season ended and that massive final dropped, I feel like social media has been split into these two camps. Fans arguing and sending silly stickers in the comments and, screaming these messages of either the vampire Armand is perfect and he did nothing wrong, and on the other side of he's terrible and disgusting and evil. And look, I know these Armand did nothing wrong memes are mostly jokes, because you can love a very messy character while also acknowledging how he did like fucked up stuff, or at least looking at why he did the things he did, but also joking that he did nothing wrong. I think beneath all of these jokes, Armand is a really complex and tragic character, and I just want to talk about it. So we're going to do a little deep dive today into Armand. I'm mainly focusing on the show, but I will reference the Vampire Chronicle books. So spoiler at that point, but I think the things I'm going to mention are like kind of like common knowledge in a way, like they're mentioned quite often. And just look at Armand is not a perfect victim, but in my opinion, he is a victim. And to understand that, we need to look at what his human life was like. Now, in the book, Armand was actually named Andre and not Arun, like in the show, and he was born in Kievan. I'm hoping I say it right, and it's just the first major East Slavic state. And he was a very devoted painter, and he was really good at like making sculptures. And in the books, then he was, kidnapped by raiders and sold into slavery, and he just lost the ground of sense of who he was and where he belonged in the world. And he was around 12 to 15. I think the books change it up sometimes. I think we could have a really interesting conversation about if this changing up and not giving us an exact age is actually just evidence of him having difficulties remembering it because he was so young. Now, as I said before, in the show, he's called Arun, and they obviously changed the history of him because of Asatsaman's appearance. But an important part that they didn't change is slavers still kidnapped him and trafficked him across the whole globe to Venice, Italy, where the ancient vampire Marius brought him. In both versions, the vampire Marius, who is again a very ancient vampire, made a video about him, kind of hating on him, but also kind of explaining his backstory. In both versions, Marius buys him. I think there's maybe even an extra layer of cultural erasure in the show. There's also the same layer in the book, but I think it's like added even more because we've seen some paintings that Marius did, and he like painted Armand's skin tone lighter in his artwork. And Marius also strips away Armand's name, turning him from Andre/Arun into Amadeo, and later Armand, gets the name Armand. And I'm going to refer to him as Armand because that's, just his name. Okay. Because of all of this, Armand learns this like very specific lesson of to survive, I must be whoever my owner wants me to be. And his whole identity becomes this sort of mask because his true self was in both versions stolen. And now it's more like he needs to change his identity to be accepted. He needs to change his identity to survive, going from Arun to Amadeo to Armand. And in the end, also kind of to Rashid in Dubai for the first season. I think that was a really interesting choice too, to again pretend to be someone else. Besides that, Armand is also a quite religious character in the books. I always felt like that in the first book, The Interview with the Vampire, he didn't seem that religious because he and Louis had this whole conversation about are vampires children of Satan. They had this really interesting talk about belief, and Armand said that because Satan is a child of God, therefore vampires are children of God too. But there was also this thing about if Louis didn't believe in God, then sin doesn't really matter. And it's more subtext in the first book, but later it becomes like really clear that he's a quite religious character. Always been a very important aspect for me as someone who's not religious themselves, but has the struggles with it and grew up really religious. In the show, they have left that out completely, which I always found quite sad because it's a very important aspect of who Armand is and why he follows certain rules. Because Armand essentially is a character that needs structure, although that structure isn't always like the most logical. But I also believe like you can show this kind of personality trait of him in other ways, and I think the show tries to do that. So it's not the end of the world. If you have like a different opinion, by the way, please write it in the comments. In general, every opinion you have, I want to know, as long as it's like not fucking hateful. I guess I understand not liking Armand to some extent, but please, guys, be like, let's be polite. Let's say that way. Let's be nice. Yeah, let's have adult conversation. How about that? Anyway, back to the text. In the book, Armand is turned into a vampire at 17, and his brain basically just stops developing mid-adolescence. And I feel like these cruel and angry outbursts that he has in the books are also kind of because he is an eternal teenager with like godlike power. And just thinking about how freaking terrible it would have been to see teenager me with like these powers, like, man, I didn't want that. So it's definitely a huge part of his identity in the books, but in the show, Armand was turned at 27, and I feel like this changes a lot about him. But it also makes his weight to becoming a vampire more agonizing, yes, more terrible. Because thinking about how he served and suffered under Marius for so many years before being turned is just dreadful. Especially because in the book version and also in the show, we learn that he was given away to brothels by Marius or offered as a gift to certain visitors. And knowing that he waited for far longer for Marius to turn him, and that he, was serving Marius. And him and Marius lived in this house where like boys went in and out, and Marius was their teacher and helped them get a better life or whatever. But Armand, like, he couldn't leave. We also know as a fact that Armand was 12 years old. So between 12 and 27, he served Marius, which is a whole 15 years of growing up under Marius' control. So in his early life, Armand was treated as an object to be bought and sold and used. And this left him, I think, with this crushing fear of being powerless, because how do you cope with something like that? There is this interesting part of him in the books. And I'm just realizing I'm mentioning the books more than I thought I would. But yeah, whatever. Please. I can't help it. I think Armand is a character that willingly obeys in certain situations, especially to powerful people, for example, like Marius, Lestat, but also to Louis. And I think the question is why? Why does he do that? So I think we always need to look at what is the reason for the action. And by the way, we should look for that in like every character. For Armand, is it because if he hands them down the crown and they think they are in charge, then he actually feels safer. I think it's like a defense mechanism in the way that I can't be crushed if I'm already bowing, and I can't be abandoned if I make them rely on my service. And looking at the interview with the vampire, this is actually supported because Armand and Louis have this very interesting conversation about Armand's leadership. Because when Claudia and Louis arrive in Paris, there is this whole conversation about how the vampires of the theater do not like them. They are not as huge part of the group as they are in the show. And Armand basically tells Louis that, yeah, they don't trust him. And Louis then tells Armand, fuck it, just you're the leader, command them. And Armand says he doesn't want that power. He doesn't want to command them. He only took the crown, he only took the scepter and the leadership because he wants distance from them. And he just wants peace and quiet. But at the same time, we know per fact that it was Armand, and Armand was also in the book involved in killing Claudia. And in the show, he was like even more involved because it was like the whole killing of Claudia was like a even bigger deal in the show. So he is a leader. He can command people. But in the books, he's also way more passive. I think all of that is a very tragic aspect of him. And it just means a lot to me on a very personal level. I do want to mention that. And since people don't always want to dominate him, he tends to become really cruel, which plays, at least in books, again, into this mindset of being an eternal vampire teenager. Besides this, his turning in the books is a little bit more explicit, because in the show it was mentioned that he was struck with a fever, while in the books we know that one of the men he had to sleep with because of Marius actually falls in love with him, and when Armand rejects him, he attacks him with a poisonous blade. The next part I want to look at is the Children of the Darkness and the Paris Theater. Because in the books, Marius is killed by Santino, who is the leader of the Children of the Darkness. Again, the Children of the Darkness are a cult who believe they serve Satan. We see this a bit in the show, but I don't think Santino was mentioned. After he loses Marius, Armand's need to control gets like wrapped up in this very dark religion, and he is forced to be part of this cult. Like, he rejects it to a certain point, but then he's like tormented by Santino in the books, and then he accepts it and is part of it. And in the show, it's not as detailed. It's only mentioned that he was given this job and he didn't want it. In the show, Armand is also the leader of the Children of the Darkness, of the Satanic Cult, and it is then, of course, Lestat that drives the vampires off the street and into the show. And I think sometimes, especially in the show, it was more to spite Armand. We haven't seen a lot about the Armand and Lestat relationship. We've seen a bit of Armand's POV, which I think is kind of like romanticized, but also he put himself in a better light. We haven't seen a lot of Lestat's version, but the things we've seen about the Lestat and Armand version of, his mind, I think is really negative. So on one hand, we have Armand's version, which portrays Armand in a like better light and leaves Gabrielle out. But then we have Lestat's version that is like really negative and like makes him kind of like detached in that relationship. And I don't think either of these are the 100% truth. I think there was like a mix of both, especially because we have this one scene of Nikki actually talking about how Armand and Lestat spend a lot of time together, even in Lestat's version. And I think there has to be more than that. Anyway, so the cult gets turned into a theater, and this is a really interesting thing, in my opinion, because it again changes who Armand is and how he's portrayed. And all of these changes about him often occur with other people interfering. Another really important piece is, and I've mentioned that in my last video actually, because I really want to see that explained in the Queen of the Damned series, and that is, in the books, it is Armand who cuts off Nikki's hand, right? Or hands. And the show made a shift, and Nikki cut off his own hand in like this fit of despair and like emotions. Now, I think Lestat was a really unreliable narrator with that, or like with many things, to be honest. And I don't know yet why Lestat would tell Daniel that it was Nikki who cut off his own hand. Like, I feel like this is a detail that has to be on purpose, and I want it explained. Now, before we look at Louis and Armand's relationship, I want to mention some things about Claudia. Obviously, it is freaking terrible that she's dead, and that Armand orchestrated this death. Now, even more in the show than in the books. Yes, that is a terrible thing to do. The same with Armand cutting off Nikki's hand is a terrible thing to do. Armand lying and manipulating Louis with the Stein photographs is a terrible thing to do. Don't believe that these characters do anything without a reason. But also out of the perspective of a writer who has been writing for more than 10 years now, it's so important to think, what are the motives of a character? And we have some great writers on the show. So I do think that things just don't happen because, there are reasons. And I think if we want to have a nuanced discussion about it, it's important to ask these reasons. So, Armand and Claudia. I feel like Armand sees himself in Claudia a bit, even more in the books than he does in the show, because again, in the show, he was older when he was turned. I think Armand looks at Claudia and sees his own nightmare. She's a fledgling trapped in a child's body, made by older, selfish vampires. And she just can't be free. And I think also Armand underestimates her a lot, because he believes she will go crazy. And I don't know if that is an unpopular opinion, but I don't believe Claudia would have become crazy. I think she would have made it. I also think that Armand in this situation is blind, because he has seen a lot of shit, and he has seen younger vampires, or the best example, he has seen Nikki, losing his mind. So I definitely believe that he was not able to see Claudia. But there's also a really interesting part of Claudia and Armand's relationship in the Interview with the Vampire book, because in the show, he's very against turning Madeline, right? He's against them meeting up. And in the book, it was really different, because it was very clear, and Claudia said that herself, that Armand wants Louis. And she said herself she thinks that Armand will kill her. It was like one of the first things she said. And she said that Louis will leave her and that she will be alone. And then she met Madeline, who was a doll maker, who lost her child in the book, by the way. And in the book, they didn't have a romantic relation. They had more of a like friendship, but also maybe like mother and daughter relationship than really a lover's relationship. Anyway, so when it comes to Madeline's turning, it was actually different, because Louis was against it. And then he had this power urge. He was like, okay, I maybe need to do it. And it was later revealed that Armand told him that he took kind of power over Louis' mind. So Armand was pro turning Madeline, because he thought that Claudia and Madeline would leave them, and then Louis, would be his. And in the show, it was also different, because Claudia was way more involved in the theater than in the books. And Armand was a way more active leader in the show. What I did really like about their relationship was that it evolves slower. And Claudia really likes the theater at the beginning, but then she gets trapped into it and trapped into these rigid rules. And that is when she realizes that this is not a life for her. Let's look at Louis and Armand's early relationship because it's very interesting and I think it plays a lot with dominance and submissiveness. So, since Louis came out of a, let's say, kind of toxic relationship, at least from his point of view, it was a very hard thing. Lestat wasn't always really well, and we've seen at the ending and how he treated Claudia apparently was really good. But we also need to remember that Claudia lied about the train situation. So that played a huge role. Louis already had a bad mind about Lestat towards the end of their relationship. And then adding the things with Claudia and the things she said, I think was like the last kick to it. And Louis was never part of the theater either. So that also created a very interesting role. Which also means the coven mistrust him more, just like in the books. There's also this other thing in Louis and Armand's relationship in which Armand seemingly tries to identify himself in the form of the relationship, in the way that he says he's a nothing without Louis, which maybe he actually thinks that, or maybe it's just a part of him that thinks that, but it gets even further in season 3 when he says that he's a room with a wall and nothing. And I think this really shows how Armand thinks about himself and how he has a lot of problems with his own identity, even in the show. And I think this is one of the most devastating moments in the character of Armand. He and Lestat's relationship was very codependent, but despite that, he still yearns for Lestat. And he still has all these complicated feelings about him, which is why he sees Lestat. Lestat, yes. Shame on me, I said it wrong. I'm so sorry. English is a hard language for me sometimes. His reluctance to being officially in a relationship with Armand, but also the distance to the theater, I think create this more dominant role for Armand. For Louis towards Armand. A lot of people talking about how icky the scene was where Louis calls Armand Arun and where also, Armand calls him Maître. And I understand that, 100%. And I also feel like that this scene was very symbolic. It was very symbolic of their roles, but it also played really nicely into the thing about Armand submitting and being like a really devout at some points. Armand is a character that really wants peace and rest and quiet, at least in the books. But it's also because, he wants someone to take charge, since that is what he's used to with Marius. This is me out of the cut right now again, and I want to add another important thing. Despite me saying that it was probably something Louis needed to be the dominant force in the relationship between him and Armand, it's obviously still a huge fucked up thing calling him Arun, and, this whole dynamic of this. Some people say it's like a slave and master dynamic, and this whole thing was still, a fucked up thing to do considering Armand's past. And I believe it was in some ways Louis using Armand's past against him. Now, I think we could argue about the fact if Louis really wanted to use his background against him, like from the start, or if he wanted it at some point in the relationship and that started to develop, or he didn't really want it and just didn't really think about it. So I think, yeah, that's an interesting thing to discuss. But I really wanted to add that because I really like Louis, but in regards of Armand's relationship and how he deals with Armand, he definitely fucked up a ton of time. And I feel like with these characters, especially sometimes when it's a male character, people forget that the traumatic things that happen in our childhood stay with us forever. And obviously, when you're an adult, you most of the time, or hopefully, learn to deal with it and not let it affect other people. But when you're such a old vampire, and vampires feel emotions differently than humans do, I think it complicates the situation. Because again, in the books, Armand was a teenager, and he isn't in the show. I know that. Though I still feel like that he has like these huge effects of what happened with Marius. So I want to take this into consideration, So when Louis offers this dominant hand, which I think Louis needed in this moment because he came out of this relationship with Lestat, Armand took this hand, But later, after Claudia's death, everything transforms. And this is one of my favorite parts, also in the books, because it's really interesting. In the books, the reason why Armand really wants Louis is because he can live through the century with Louis, because of Louis, because Louis is a younger vampire. Not just younger, he is a younger vampire, you know. After Claudia's death, everything changes because Louis starts to become very distant, and that is a thing in the books too, or in the book primarily, because there's this whole scene about how he barely talks with Armand, how he just fucks off a lot. They travel together, but there's still not a connection anymore. And Louis always describes it in the way that he feels like his human part and his fascination with being a human or feeling things like human just died with Claudia, which I think is a very interesting piece because him being so human is a huge part of the first book. And in the show, we see that too with Louis taking all these boys in, killing them, and just fucking off, and Armand needing to clean up for him. And that is where Daniel comes into play. Now, the same with Louis. I think Armand is in the books really fascinated with him because he can live through the century through Daniel. And Daniel just teaches him a lot of things. And there are also some really fun facts about how Armand keeps dressing him up and Armand throws his own clothes out every day. Another thing about how Armand keeps renting apartments and then kind of forgets about it, and that drives Daniel insane, which is valid. Anyway, so in the show it's again a bit different because the whole dynamic between Armand and Daniel is different just by the fact that Daniel is older and not this scared young boy anymore. And again, I really love it. I love Devil's Minion in the show. I think it's going to be very exciting for season 4. Anyway, so in the show, Armand is very fascinated by Daniel. And I do want to mention a really interesting fact, which is we see how Armand deals with his victims, how he deals with Daniel. He has this very soothing voice. He tells Daniel how Daniel's whole life is kind of meaningless because Daniel already knows how everything will go. And he kind of like portrays death as the better solution so that Daniel can rest. And we see the same thing with Rest, although not as detailed in season 3, when Armand kills one of Lizard's band members. And I think that is very interesting because in the book, Armand is very seductive with his victims, also very soothing and touchy, and holding them a lot. And I do not have a preference. I think both versions are really good. I think the version of the book is obviously a bit more closer when it comes to touching and physical intimacy, while the version in the show is more talking. But we do see Amon like reaching out for Daniel in the scene, so that fits too. And I'm really excited to see the Devil's Minion Daniel turning scene. I think Assad and Eric talked about how it was a very violent scene in their opinion, which is an interesting choice because it was quite consensual in a lot of ways. I mean, obviously, Amon didn't really want to turn Daniel, but it was the consensual from Daniel's part, which we don't have in the show apparently, but we will see. We will see what they do. And also, there's this very amazing TikToker, and they made this very nice theory, which I've been thinking about the whole day, which is in the final of season 2, after the interview ended, Aman says something to Daniel along the lines of, "I hope you join us for dinner." And this content creator talked about how maybe they wanted to turn Daniel. Because there was also this scene of earlier of Louis saying he would turn Daniel. And maybe that was like Louis' subtext way of trying to ask for consent. And Daniel said no. But maybe they still wanted to turn Daniel. By that meaning Louis turning Daniel for Armand, which would also make sense considering Louis kind of knew that Daniel was being stalked by Armand. I don't know if Armand told Louis everything, which is a huge part too, and I don't think he did tell him everything, but Louis did know about this behavior.
Here from the cut here right now, I don't have my microphone, it's empty, I'm so sorry. But a very important thing that I've forgotten, which is very, very important about Daniel and Armand, is that Armand has never turned a vampire because he believes that every fledgling will hate their master. So that is a very important detail we always need to explore and think about.
Anyway, so back to Armand and his personality. I think he is a very complex character. And we end this season with him forcing an apology out of Louis. Because another very important thing about their character, based on the backstory, is Louis was a pimp. And Armand was a slave. And Armand was forced to be a servant and forced into sexual activities. I think that is a very intense dynamic, and I think it needed to be addressed. Did Armand do it in a good way? Well, I don't know. I don't know. You could discuss about it in the comments if you think that this scene was a good play out. I think it was a very interesting scene. I think it was a scene that they needed to be had. There was also some talking about how this scene was a scene where Armand is finally being understood, and I didn't feel it as a way of, oh, he's being finally understood now. But that was a conversation they needed to have. And that is where we kind of end this season with Armand. Again, I believe that these Armand did nothing wrong. He can't do anything, or yeah, sure, blame the guy who actually did some things. It's a joke. But we also need to have like serious discussions sometimes about these characters. So only request is please try to think about why a character does a certain thing before being so extreme sometimes about it. And you can have your opinion, even if it's an extreme opinion, fuck whatever I said. It's your life, it's your choice. It's just my wish. I wish we could have online some more nuanced discussion about it. I think fitting Armand into these, oh, this is good and this is bad, and he's a good character and he's a bad character, doesn't really help with seeing who he is as a character. Thing goes also for every other character in Interview with the Vampire and the Vampire Chronicles. I think the point is to not put them in these boxes. They live hundreds of years long. So let's think about why they do certain things. I think everything has a purpose. And yeah, so that's like my thoughts today. Thank you for watching this video. Please always feel free to give me your opinion. Please like if you like this video and follow if you haven't.